Hello, can you hear me all right? Wonderful. I'm Natasha Logan. I'm the Chief Program Officer here at the Studio Museum in Harlem, and I am full of joy to welcome you here tonight. We are here to think about the legacy and the preservation of the work of Tom Lloyd. So I'm going to tell you just a little bit about what we did today for those who weren't here. We spent the day with several sonic virtuosos. We had Lorraine, Matthew Jamal, Nikita Gale, and Robert Aubrey Lowe, and previously some experiments by Warner Meadows and Amy Meredith Cox, who all brought to life a vision that we were able to make manifest by Lloyd. Tom Lloyd envisioned this exhibition and his work to be activated by the sonic traditions of musicians, jazz musicians, and dancers wearing colorful costumes. And it was wonderful to be able to experiment with that and bring it to life in a contemporary manner. And now, to cap that off, we get to learn together, listening to four intimidatingly brilliant individuals. We have here on the panel, and I'm not going to read their bios, but we will say their names. So joining us, we have Dr. Emily Verla Bovino, Habiba Hopson, and Krista Thompson, who will be speaking with our very own curator, Connie Choi. Connie organized the Tom Lloyd exhibition on the third floor with Habiba Hopson, a former senior curatorial assistant. This crew will be in conversation about Tom Lloyd and his work across a variety of disciplines and mediums, as well as his advocacy for the artists of color through his work with the Arts Workers Coalition and the Storefront Museum, and more. As you know, exhibiting Lloyd is a full circle moment for the museum. His sculptures inaugurated our exhibitions when we opened in 1968, and through the rigorous research and care of this team, they returned to our walls in this inaugural moment here on the third floor. I'll let Connie take it away.
Well, we're actually going to start with a video which will help set the tone for what we're going to be talking about.
Ademola Olugbefola. The origin is from West Africa, specifically the Yoruba tribe.
How do you feel about having an opening at a community museum such as the Storefront Museum?
Well, I'm very honored and pleased that Brother Tom Lloyd invited me, number one, and this is right, in my groove, because my work is specifically geared for the community, even though I always address myself to an international audience, but I'm basically concerned with black people. And the opportunity to show right here in the neighborhood where, there's children and people direct from the community is something that I'm very much in favor of.
Close-fitting cover-up, U-shaped halter, low-waisted back and cut-out side and front business. Rose's outfit was made and designed by herself.
Well, what we're interested in, Janet, is kind of presenting a new idea of giving funds out to sickle cell people. That is, we'd rather give to families rather than to say just for research, because we know that this takes millions of dollars and that has to come from government. But the funds that we raised as a community, we want to give directly to sickle cell families so they can benefit and take care of their financial needs and things like this. Why we're having it at the Storefront Museum, because we feel that the Storefront Museum is an important part of our community, and instead of taking any monies outside of the community, doing anything else other than presenting the Storefront Museum as a cultural, interested party about sickle cell anemia also. They lended their museum to on our behalf this afternoon, so we are really grateful to them also.
Well, thank you very much.
I wanted to start the panel, now that we've seen some of the programming that the Storefront Museum offered, always for free, to the community in Jamaica, Queens, asking our panelists here how they were first introduced to Lloyd's work and what is it about that work that really resonated with them. Krista?
Thanks, Connie. I just want to congratulate you too on all the fantastic work that you've done. When I first started doing this work, it was on the heels of a book that I'd written on contemporary artists who were using light within their work. And I was really interested in looking up historical precedents for this. And of course, Lloyd really stood out to me. I need to also acknowledge Kelly Jones's work, in which she, in Energy Experimentation, which was an exhibition that looked at kind of abstract art in the 1960s and early 70s. But she was really the only person who I could find who was writing about his work and reproducing his work at the time. And I just started doing a little research and was so just puzzled by the way that he seemed to be so visible for a very brief historical moment. And then his work really couldn't be found in a lot of collections. And so to see the exhibition and to see how many works are now available for us to appreciate and to study is a testament to all the work that you've done.
I just want to add that show that you mentioned, Energy Experimentation, Black Artists in Abstraction, 1964 to 1980, was actually organized by Kelly Jones for the Studio Museum. So that happened in our former building in 2006, 2007. So it's been 20 years for you now in terms of really thinking about Lloyd's practice.
Right, yeah. Not quite, not quite from this. I mean, it was really after Shine that I started to dig deeper into his practice. And, you know, I was really interested in both what he was doing and the question surrounding why he seemed to have disappeared after being so visible for a long time. And so that's been a part of what really resonated, trying to figure out what was happening art historically at the time, and also trying to think about, like, art history and who is made a subject of art history and who isn't. And Lloyd just seemed a really interesting person to ask those questions around because of his visibility across so many artistic communities for a long time. And then really until fairly recently, you couldn't find a lot of information about him, particularly his light sculptures.
Yeah. Emily?
Yes, I am actually coordinator of a small art history program at York College of the City University of New York in Jamaica, Queens, which is the grounds, are the grounds where Lloyd intervened in 1971 and created the Storefront Museum. Actually, his work with York started before 1971, when he created the survey, the Community Artists Cultural Survey, that informed then the project of the Storefront Museum. And a number of York students, I think around 24 York College students, were involved in the survey in 1970. And the campus itself wasn't built until it didn't open, let's say, until 1986, which meant that from the moment of the authorization of York College CUNY for Jamaica, which took place in 1968, the grounds were lots of issues, right, with the grounds, in the sense that, and Lloyd foresaw this, and that's the reason why he wanted to use a building leased month by month that was on the York College urban renewal area, because he was concerned that there would be impacts for the neighborhood with the fact that there would be empty buildings, there would be lots that weren't being used, and so he felt there was going to be actually what he called it, I think the term was social-cultural trauma, as a result of these conditions. So Lloyd started the museum with the idea that he was going to be intervening in an urban renewal area. And I think that's a really important aspect of the project to remember. And for me, as a faculty member at York, I joined York College as faculty in 2023. And I joined not knowing, actually, that York had this incredible public art collection, which, if you don't mind, Connie, going to slide 17, I was not aware. I was aware of this incredible human being named Margaret Rose Vendrius, who's an artist and art historian who wrote a seminal book on Richmond Barthé. And I was aware that I was applying for a job that Margaret had decided, Dr. Vendrius had decided to resign from in order to take up a position, incredible position at Tufts. And she had tragically passed away before taking up the position. So I never got to meet her. But I was aware of her work, and her work starting the Southeast Queens Artist Alliance and the Southeast Queens Biennial, and a residency at York during the summer with Queens Museum. Her work was what really inspired me, and I thought, I want to be able to continue this person's work. That's why I was inspired to apply for the job. And when I came onto the campus, I walked through the Archer Avenue entrance, and I saw this incredible work, which I recognize as being a work by Martin Puryear, only because I know Martin Puryear's work. There was no label. A work that was created in 1986 titled Arc. If you can go to the next slide, then I saw this incredible work into the south of the building called Solar Canopy by the artist Sam Gilliam, also from 1986. And if you can go to the next slide, then outside on 160th work, a work by Houston Conwell, which I recognized because of the motifs being similar to also the time capsules work that he has created that's here in the Studio Museum. And then saw in the library, if you can go to the next slide, this magnificent mahogany carving by Elizabeth Catlett. And I was, wow, like incredible, and nothing to my knowledge on the website. So it was through this collection that I actually got reintroduced to Lloyd, who I'd first been introduced to in around 2015 through a book by Susan Kahan called Mounting Frustration. And I learning about the public art collection, I would talk to anyone who I could about it and ask questions, and I integrate into my classes. And at some point, collaborating with Queens Central Library, Queens Memory Oral History Project, a colleague, Meryl Agish, said to me, do you know about the Storefront Museum? Because that was on York's campus. We have the papers. I said, Storefront Museum. And I vaguely remembered then the connection between Lloyd and the Storefront Museum, went into the papers and discovered that the reason why we actually have this incredible collection of public art, and these are only 4 works that I showed you, is really because of Lloyd's presence. And in part, this collection, sadly, was part of, it appears to me in the archival records, an effort of the college to replace, to placate, right, the concerns that the museum was going to be displaced, right? And so I was very interested in, exactly after reading your book too, carrying with me thoughts from Shine, like this question of unvisibility and this question of the hyper visibility, because to me, right, the public art at York it's very visible, but at the same time, right, it's there kind of canceling out and disappearing this other museum because the college proposed itself as a museum in 1984, right when Lloyd's Storefront Museum is being evicted. So I think that this, history at the college was so important to me to try also to understand what happened here, and also the dynamics and the ways that the artists responded to this condition of being aware that there was a shift taking place in post-fiscal crisis New York. That's the period of 71 to 85. Right, there was a significant shift that happened in terms of like the power that artists had over funding and to start initiatives. Everything became more centralized and institutionalized after that period. And so there was real power that was taken away from the neighborhood and being able to make decisions for itself by CUNY. And I think as somebody who loves CUNY, I also feel it's important that we're honest about the history of our university system and the ways in which, right, it has participated also in displacement while being an agent of social mobility. Sorry, I went on for way too long. Apologies. Yeah.
Wow.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Krista. And thank you, Connie, first of all, for the invitation. And thank you all for being here today and spending your Saturday afternoon with us. I don't remember the first time I learned of Lloyd's work, but I do remember the first time I sort of discovered his strong belief system on what Black art was, what Black art is. And to him, Black art was not just Black art by Black artists, but Black art by Black artists for Black audiences. And this is something that he spoke about very frequently, but specifically I read in a transcript of a conversation that happened in 1969 at the Metropolitan Museum of Art with artists Hale Woodruff, Romare Bearden, Sam Gilliam, Richard Hunt, William T. Williams.
Was Benny there?
Benny wasn't there, I don't think. But this conversation with Black artists where they're really, it was quite a contentious conversation where they're really discussing what Black art is. And Tom on this panel, or Mr. Lloyd, on this panel was the most expressive and vocal about Black art being something that was specifically for Black audiences. And I remember feeling really compelled by this idea and feeling like it still resonated today. And for Lloyd, it wasn't just an abstract idea. It really was something that he practiced and that he materialized through the founding of the Storefront Museum, which was the first art museum in Queens and the first in the borough dedicated to African American art. So to me, studying Lloyd and realizing that he really sort of explored this idea of what does it mean to make a museum that is actually responsive to the community. Before he built the Storefront Museum in 1971, I think you both alluded to this. In 1970, him and your college students and a few other people, artists that were sort of within the AWC, the Art Workers Coalition, canvassed. Oh yeah, here's the questionnaire. They canvassed neighborhoods in Queens. So they went around to different neighborhoods in Queens, specifically South Jamaica, with this questionnaire asking people, do you want a cultural center in your neighborhood? If so, what would you envision there? And the responses, which are in the archives of the Queens Central Library in Jamaica, range. There's 4-year-olds that are writing on this questionnaire like, oh, I want a swimming pool, or oh, I want dance classes, or oh, I want karate classes. And in the following year, he builds the Storefront, and they actually have karate classes. They actually have dance classes. There's programs for sickle cell anemia, which you saw in the video. There's also fine art exhibitions with artists like Ademola Alugabefola, who, as he mentioned, is an artist that is preaching to a wide audience, but very much is interested in art for Black people. So I think it's just fascinating, right, to think, here we are in the Studio Museum, like, what does it mean to build an institution that is as responsive, that is as ambitious, and is as embedded in the community as Storefront? I find it really interesting.
Yeah. Thank you all. I think some of you were here earlier in the day, as Natasha Logan alluded to, in terms of the activations that we had in the galleries, and those were really beautiful sonic and visual performances in the gallery. And the reason why we decided to close the Tom Lloyd exhibition with these activations is because he talked about how he wanted his work to be seen as part of what he termed an environment. He wanted his works to be activated with a multi-sensory experience, so that you weren't just looking at one work of art, you were experiencing the artwork through sound, right? Through the visual, through all manner of kind of ways in which your whole body would be resonating with the work. And so that type of understanding of how his work would live beyond just a visual experience, but really a human experience, a bodily experience, I think is one that we so beautifully, tried to honor earlier in the afternoon, but one that I think speaks to an understanding about how he wanted a broader understanding of the arts, what the arts could be, right? It wasn't just about visual arts, it was about dance and music and, karate and all the things that he brought to the Storefront Museum. So can we all maybe talk about how we might understand how he created environments, right? Not just for himself, but for others, for his community?
Well, if I can pick up on that question, if we can go to the next slide. So just to expound on the questionnaire, because I think the questionnaire is key to answering that question. This is a list, and just to frame, Lloyd is distributing this questionnaire at a time when artists are starting to use information and polls. Hans Hake, for instance, is well known for distributing surveys within the museums, asking people where they are from so that he can map within the museum context where people are living and where they're resident. So Lloyd is embarking on this survey project at a time when artists are turning to information as a source of their artistic practice. And so I think it's important and interesting to think about this survey within the broader context of an extension of his artwork. What's interesting is this is a breakdown of the many artists that were working with him. At times he was working with 12 to 16 artists. They were going across different boroughs, across New York, and they were going out and asking people what they wanted from their institutions. And each of the artists were tasked with forming coalitions with groups that existed in different communities and getting their input. So we have this massive collection of data and studying and research and taking polls at a time when there's a lot of pressure being put on museums and artists are really trying to mobilize to get museums to start collecting Black work and showing Black and Puerto Rican art. Lloyd starts taking a different tactic. He was like, what would it look like to build our own institutions? What would it look like to have institutions that are built from the ground up, that are responsive to what is going on within these communities? So he really proposed that the results from these surveys would form 8 institutions across different communities. And one of these institutions he described as an experimental aspect of the outcome of this project. And getting back to Connie's question in terms of environments, there's often seen as this arc of Tom Lloyd kind of working with his kind of light work and then becoming more institutionally minded and starting to work on the Storefront Museum. And interestingly, almost in the middle of that arc is him proposing to create an environment that could be set within different communities across New York. And he proposed that each of these environments, so he wanted to create what he called a light sound environment that would be based on these modular light sculptures. And they would be put into different communities, and communities would program them, and a kind of truck sound system that accompanied them. And they would decide what their needs were, and they would work together. He also saw it as an important educational program. So you're working with scientists, you're working with designers, you're working with light and sound engineers. And these modular configurations could actually be like bodily activated. But the point is that he wanted, in the same way that he wanted the survey to really inform how we could reimagine what art museums could be, he wanted this modular light work to become this thing that every community would create within their own environments. So I think there's a really interesting arc in his own career where he starts out really wanting a Black art wing. He wants the museums to create a space, and a space that's autonomous enough that it wouldn't be lost. Black and Puerto Rican art wouldn't be lost within the larger narratives of the museum. But over time, particularly as he's starting to research and to ask questions, and again, if you think of the sociality, he's like creating this research by having people go out, asking questions. The social gathering is such an important part of what was motivating this. And at the end of it, he wanted to create these modular works that would take the form within these environments. And this is a kind of mock-up of a work that I think might have been him as he's trying to configure this kind of modular sound environment. And I have two, I guess, 6-page descriptions as he's trying to raise funds in order to produce this work. But the point is that he goes from wanting a space in museums to actually putting work into Black communities and saying, like, your expressions are the art. Like, I am literally putting what you're doing into visibility. And I'm not just telling you this is a space and putting work in it, but I want you to be, I'm giving you the tools to create your own environment. How do you move from thinking about museums as something where art is going and being ordained into this space, but turning to the environment itself and turning to communities and giving them the tools to create their own environments that are responding to their own notions about what art is?
Krista, can you say a little bit more about the Art Workers Coalition, just for folks maybe who don't have the background about what happened at MoMA?
The Art Workers Coalition is a group of artists. Lloyd becomes involved with them because some of the members are a part of the Howard Weiss Gallery, which is where he begins showing some of his artwork. So he gets involved with these artists that are really trying to get the museum communities to rethink their structures, and they are dealing with a variety of issues, from copyright for artists, something that's still very prevalent. But Lloyd was really interested in trying to get the museums to diversify and was a part of the Art Workers Coalition committees that were devoted to trying to get the museums, at first, to create a Black art wing. And then, interestingly, he wanted museums to create these study centers as really important aspects of the museum, even more so than creating a wing, which is something else that I think is an interesting choice, like almost creating these spaces of research and archiving as central to his work. And so as a part of the Art Workers Coalition, this kind of survey comes out of one of the many groups that Lloyd is working with. And the coalition is really bringing together a collection of artists working with different aims, but Lloyd is so central across the different groups that are being set up within the Art Workers Coalition. And I think, the Art Workers Coalition, often it's said that the artists in the Art Workers Coalition really separated their artistic practice from the activism of the Art Workers Coalition. And I think Lloyd might be unique in that he goes into the Art Workers Coalition and his interest in light work changes and transforms. And he literally, the work that he's doing as a part of the coalition starts informing his artistic practice. And the work that he wants to do doesn't ever leave his interest in light, but manifests in a different way through these sound light environments that he wanted to create.
Okay, thank you. Emily, Habiba, if you have thoughts on the idea of environments and creating spaces that are kind of active and multisensory?
I just wanted to share an image 23 so that you get a sense of what the museum looked like and what replaced it. It's 23. So the image on your left is the museum seen from outside with this beautiful community mural that Lloyd designed and worked with his family also on executing.
Jaleel painted. Yes.
And then you see on the right what replaced the museum after the museum was evicted, the Health and Physical Education building at York College, which actually inside, if you go back to, there's the image before this one, inside, ironically, is this beautiful collage by the artist Al Loving, which is I see it as a kind of marker of the absent presence of Lloyd. It's called perpetual motion. And Lloyd was a person who is in perpetual motion constantly, kind of thinking of new situations to create. But I think you see the difference clearly, right, between the environment that Lloyd was trying to create, which I can just say reflects exactly what Krista was just describing, and the environment then that was kind of taken back, right, by the City University of New York, by the city, in re-centralizing, right? Because Lloyd talked about his work as being part of this decentralization of museums. And so what you see happening after the fiscal crisis is this re-centralization. So there is this moment of possibility where a lot of artists are taking opportunities, and they're thinking tactically, right, about these opportunities, like the urban renewal area. I can go in and I can lease a building month to month. And yes, okay, it's possible that I will be eventually be evicted, but really, in the case of Tom Lloyd, he really believed that he was going to be able to keep the museum going, to the point where he also developed these proposals to recycle the building, which would mean actually taking the building and rebuilding it in another location, but taking the building that had been retrofitted, a Goodyear tire shop, right? Taking that building and putting it in another environment, so that the space, right, that environment, it being self-determined, was important to him. And I just want to share, going off of what Krista was saying too, in the 1980s, as he's preparing for this potential displacement, that he sees coming, because this is before he actually receives the eviction notice. He talked about this new idea for an African American cultural center, and he said the new idea was to evolve from an embryonic storefront museum beginning to a permanent community-based cultural institution culmination. I like the wording here, right? Like this move from something embryonic, a beginning, to a culmination. And I want to say that Lloyd also understood he was part of a community of people. So that also speaks back to the question of environment. He welcomed, if you can go to slide 25, he welcomed Carl Clay and the Black Spectrum Theater to the Storefront Museum. Carl Clay's Black Love performance is still being performed now in different iterations, and the Black Spectrum Theater continues to exist in St. Albans. And the first performance was actually at the Storefront Museum in 1971. And same, if you go to the next slide, he was supporting Black photographers in Queens, and also Vincent Smith's work. Vincent Smith is the only artist who comes up in the minutes of the public art selection who was part of Lloyd's projects at the Storefront Museum, who was considered actually for the collection at York, but his submission, interestingly, was denied for part of the program that was supposed to be guaranteed to go to quote-unquote community minority artists. That's artists who worked in Queens. It was denied because Vincent Smith, the committee said, wasn't based in Queens. But Vincent Smith had an exhibition at the Storefront Museum. So, the question of who was based in Queens and who the community wanted, right, to be actually part of the collection was questionable. Lloyd was constantly advocating on behalf of other artists, and that's evident in the correspondence with politicians about the York collection, where Lloyd is saying, I'm concerned about what's going to happen at York, and who's going to be represented in these committees, and who's going to be selected for the commissions, and he's constantly there trying to advocate not on behalf of himself, but on behalf of opportunities for other artists. So I think hopefully that speaks to some of.
Yeah, I think if you could go to slide 12, I think the answer really to this question as it relates to the Storefront Museum, thinking of an environment, creating an environment that has multiple different art forms coalescing together in one event can really be seen through this annual festival that Storefront hosted every summer in late July, early August, called the African Festival, that he hosted between the mid 1970s through the end of the Storefront Museum's closure in 1986. And in this Africa Festival, which was over 2 days, brought together different artists, performers, drummer bands, dance performances, but also on the outskirts was a sort of a bustling marketplace where people were selling different homemade goods, different goods that were either brought from Africa or by people that were from Queens. And so I could think of this time being perhaps like the best 2 days of the summer in Queens. Like if you were strolling down Jamaica Avenue, you probably heard a lot of the sounds coming from this area of Storefront Museum, which Tom Lloyd called the Kwame Nkrumah Mall. So this mural that Emily pointed out, which was painted and designed by Lloyd and his children, was dedicated to the first president and prime minister of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, following Ghana's independence in 1957, who seemed to be a really huge inspiration to Lloyd in the way that Kwame Nkrumah had such a self-determination for Africans in Africa.
Since we've been speaking about the ways in which Lloyd moved through different communities of people, I'd like to talk about these networks, right? Lloyd didn't work in a silo. Most artists don't work in a silo. The works that he made that are upstairs in the third floor gallery were because of a deep partnership and collaboration that he had with an engineer named Alan Sussman, who he met fortuitously at an outdoor art fair in Manhattan in the 1960s. And so this idea of collaboration is one that resonated throughout his practice. Can we speak, we've mentioned a little bit, right, in terms of, Krista, you're saying these light sound environments or these works, he wanted really a partnership with, different engineers, different technicians, obviously in terms of the Storefront Museum, all these collaborations with the work that he was doing, in Queens itself. Can we talk about what some of these networks were and what that might say about how he operated within the art world and also the art worlds, right, because there's not just one?
Yeah, I can maybe start. And maybe we'll just single out a few people because, Lloyd, of course, did not work in a silo in creating the Storefront Museum. His family was hugely involved. And then also he had stakeholders that were politicians in Queens, some that he had great relations with, some that he didn't. But someone that he had a great relationship with was Cynthia Jenkins, who was the first African-American woman from Southeast Queens that was voted to state assembly rather. And in the Storefront Museum's archives, which are held in the Queens Library, there are multiple correspondences between him and Cynthia's really advocating for Storefront to remain in the site that it is. And so I can imagine at that time having someone like Cynthia, who had a bit of power at the time, was hugely influential. She loved the Africa Festival. She encouraged the continuation of the Africa Festival and all of the programs that Lloyd had put together. And I think it really speaks to both Lloyd and Cynthia's sort of interest in providing a space again for both artists but people of Queens that needed that space at the time.
I think that Lloyd is so interesting because he is involved in so many different artist groups. He starts off with the Black Emergency Cultural Coalition. This is a group that is really coming together to protest Harlem on My Mind, which is a show that opens at the Met, which a lot of visual artists are upset that photography becomes the primary medium. But ultimately, he would critique Benny Andrews, who is one of the leaders of that coalition, arguing that they weren't kind of living in the communities that they were advocating for. I'm just saying what the critique was. I'm not getting on board with that. But I'm also interested in, Lloyd also thought that a lot of their interest in the museum was, again, getting in the museum. How do we get the museum to give us a show or to include us in different ways? And Lloyd becomes increasingly not interested in simply getting in the museum and leaving the institution as it is. So then he moves to the Art Workers Coalition. Some of the Art Workers Coalition are a part of the GAG, the Guerrilla Arts Action Group. And Lloyd would go with them on a lot of their protests. They would do these protests in museums. And Lloyd would often come with them as a witness because they needed a witness for what they assumed might be legal cases against them. So he's also like hanging out with GAG. He's a part of the Art Workers Coalition. He and Faith Ringgold are really working together and creating these protests and giving tours in the museum about like what could be in the museum but isn't on the walls. And you know, so he's really working across these communities. And then he's also in this network of artists that I mentioned who are coming out of the Howard Weiss Gallery. In the Met kind of transcript for the roundtable, he also mentions being a part of what he called the Black Young Environments or something, which is a group that if anyone has any, he calls it the Black Visual Environments. And he said that he was a part of this group and that they were professional artists that were going to change the art world. And so I'm not sure if anyone has information on this group. I would love to find out more information. But again, he's like precisely working at the intersection of all of these different groups, which again makes it so curious that he, you know, would fall out of some of the historical accounts of this period when he just had his hands in so many of the networks that were really buzzing and, you know, activating the art communities at the time.
And I just also want to mention in terms of networks, you know, for those of you who saw the video that's up on the third floor outside of the exhibition, will hear Carol and Jaleel talk about their experience growing up with their father and how he would take them to these protests, right? So he was involving his family, involving his children in ensuring that they, right, were part of this, right? That they understood what the world was and how he was trying to shape it into a better place.
Right.
And that was also the case in Jamaica. The papers show that Lloyd was also in all of these different community groups that were making demands that were very important. For example, like against a project for artist housing because there hadn't been a consultation with any of the artists in the neighborhood, right, about what did they actually need in terms of support. Or, for example, the General Services Administration proposing Houston Conwell's work for the Social Security building. While on one hand, of course, that was important because it was an opportunity for Houston Conwell, really important Black artists. But at the same time, Lloyd's concern again goes back to like the processes of how these things are taking place. Like how come nobody is being consulted and why is the GSA just coming in and making decisions for the community? It's not animosity towards the artist, it's a concern with the processes. And I want to go back to what you were saying about Cynthia Jenkins. I just want to share, you know, Cynthia Jenkins, when Lloyd was, there was a moment in 1987 when the New York Times published an image of a shuttered storefront museum that talked about how somebody had referred an investigation to the Manhattan District Attorney that Lloyd should be investigated for misusing Department of Cultural Affairs funds. And you know, this was not an actual investigation happened, but that an investigation had been referred, and eventually there was no investigation, so then there was a follow-up report. And Cynthia Jenkins made the point that she felt that Lloyd, to the New York Times, that Lloyd was being targeted because he had offended people in power with his outspoken views and advocacy of greater opportunities for Black artists. I think that just shows, to your point, how much she supported him. Somebody else who I wanted to mention, who I don't know that much about, but I'm fascinated by and would like to learn more about, is Jamila Wilson, who was the head of the board, who did a lot of work with Lloyd. And Alton Walden, at least from the York side, Alton Walden was an assemblyman at the time, and somebody was sharing York College minutes with Lloyd, because that's how Lloyd found out in 1980 that the 1981 plan was for the public art collection at York, and that it was going to be predominantly white artists, with only Martin Puryear and Romare Bearden. And so when that changed the process. That changed the process at York. So they changed the process to have a community art committee, which shows that they were aware, right, of the way of Lloyd's processes. And that community art committee then made selections that were heavily influenced by conversations that seem to be circulating right around the neighborhood, and it's not clear exactly where the community art committee members are getting ideas for different artists, aside from the art consultant. But there are clearly other ideas coming into the committee, and so you see the committee change, and it's really the committee changed the profile of the collection to what we currently have at York. And Alton Walden was critical in that, because Alton Walden was communicating with the president Lloyd's concerns. Whether or not Lloyd actually ever got to have a meeting with the York College president isn't clear about the collection, but it is clear that there was a definite impact from the records, because it seemed that the Community Art Committee was aware a petition was circulating, and Lloyd was always circulating petitions. The most famous one, I think, in Jamaica is the one that he circulated against the Jamaica Arts Center, where he proposed there that actually Jamaica Arts Center should be replaced by the Clifford Glover Arts Center, in honor of a young black child who had 10 years old who'd been murdered by a white police officer shot in the back. So Lloyd was constantly coming up with he wasn't just protesting, he was coming up with counter proposals, right, with different processes as part of them for how to execute on what he was looking to do through his network.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you all. I'd like to now maybe pivot just for a moment to talk about why we're here, right? We have all spent a lot of time thinking about Lloyd, researching Lloyd. Lloyd himself faced a number of challenges throughout his career, which we've now heard a lot about. Can we talk about the challenges of researching, right? Challenges of understanding an artist whose career has been so under-recognized, whose papers maybe don't exist in an archive, who doesn't have the recognition or the kind of scholarship that so many other artists do. What were some of the challenging or stumbling blocks for you in the course of your own research? And what maybe hints or suggestions might you have for those of us in the audience who are really attempting to dive into research on some figures that might not have as much information about them?
Yeah, such a great question. And I guess for context, I did research specifically on the Storefront Museum, so going back and forth to the Queens Central Library to piece together what was the history of the Storefront Museum. And it was honestly a daunting task, because I don't know if anyone's necessarily ever written a conclusive essay or paper on the Storefront Museum. So it became a really interesting task for me to parse through documents, pictures, video footage that we could find about what the Storefront Museum looked like, what visitors maybe perceived of the Storefront Museum, how the facility was used, what different activities it offered. I mean, I think with research, every week that I went to Queens Library, I discovered an additional program that the Storefront did. Okay, like karate classes. Okay, what else? Oh, there was maybe a dance class dedicated to Catherine Dunham's practice, or there were so many activities for all age groups also too, which I just found really interesting. But I also kind of, in addition to the daunting task being the fact that there wasn't previous literature on the Storefront Museum, I kind of became obsessed with this idea of why did the Storefront close? Was it, and at the time I was also doing research on the Studio Museum's history, and so wondering, okay, why has the Studio Museum persisted? What if, similar missions, right, being dedicated to art by Black artists, being within a community, a Black community, what was it that led to the Studio Museum's continuity, and what was it that led to Storefront's closure? sort of wondering whether perhaps maybe it was Lloyd's separatist nationalist beliefs that led to it, or maybe something else. I think this is a topic that I still sort of think about as to why, beyond the structural pressures of raising funding, of getting institutional support, what else was that, what else didn't allow Storefront to persist in the way it did, given the immense impact that it had on the community. So it's something that I still sort of think about. And I guess for tips for anyone that just to, I guess, maybe understand that there can never be a conclusive paper, and that you just really do what you can from your own point of view.
Well, I think as somebody who really started off being very interested in more of the light sculptures, one of the challenges that I encountered was for a long time not being able to find any examples that were actually functioning or that I had access to. I came across a work that was at NYU at the time and actually went to see it, and they were able to turn it on. And actually in the act of turning it on, it was on for maybe 30 seconds before the fuse kind of blew. And you could just like smell this kind of smoke in the room. And so this horrifying, so both this moment of elation of actually seeing a work that had its original mechanics functioning, and then seeing it seeing it just stop working almost immediately after it was turned on, and then thinking about my own process in wanting to somehow bring some kind of visibility and interest to his work, actually interceding into this work functioning for a while. And so I think one of the challenges, and again, thinking about light and knowledge production, right, as this kind of metaphor for what can be seen and visible. So a lot of the challenges just really surrounded the access to the material, the fact that Lloyd was working with a material that was very ephemeral, just really compounded some of the problems surrounding his work. Interestingly, on the back of this work, once it stopped working, there were 3 light switches on it. One was on, off, and another one was a knob that had disregard on it. And I loved just thinking about that and thinking about Lloyd's own process of working as he's trying to labor with and figure out this technology, and this like tempting, knob about if you don't disregard the sign saying to disregard, like what is the consequence, right? But thinking more broadly, like when you encounter these artists who are not visible in the ways that you think they might be, how do we almost take the flip side of that, like literally thinking of the disregard button as being on the flip side, and to start asking questions about like why are they not visible, and asking questions about your own kind of process of working, and somehow documenting that to expand the story. Often, as somebody who gets, thank you, as somebody who gets a lot of graduate student applications, one of the favorite, phrases that I hear is, and I'm filling a gap in art history by doing X. And I'm always so curious about that. But I would just say that, getting to Connie's question about like, what do you do in these instances, right? Instead of fill a gap, what does it tell us if that person hasn't been legible? What does it tell us about what the canon is? How do we put pressure on what that canon is as opposed to trying to fill a gap in? And Lloyd was so canon busting in terms of the work that he was really wanting to do, that it requires a different engagement and a different critical engagement with a broader project of thinking art history. And so I would just say that is one of the challenges and opportunities of working with artists that don't have a lot written about them.
I'd like to actually talk about the facilitators in my research. Could you go to slide 28, sorry. And that starts with your college students and bringing them to the Storefront museum papers and having them look through the papers and do original writing from them. I learned so much from that, from just giving the students a finding aid and seeing what they choose to focus on, seeing that they choose to focus on the anti-apartheid Queens-based organization that was fighting against apartheid in South Africa, that they're interested in that they're then picking up, right, the documents, some of the materials that went into producing this book. That the Storefront Museum published, A Study in Triumph, African Americans in Queens County, New York, 1683 to 1983, looking through documents from that. If you can go to the next slide, or wonderful people who want to do walkthroughs of the public art collection and then go and visit at York and then go and visit the Queens Archives, so we can kind of come full circle and have an understanding of how we got to where we are now and where we want to go. That you see a group there on the left that was organized by curator Amara Thomas. And on the right, you see my wonderful supporters, Southeast Queens, members of the Southeast Queens Artists Alliance, Regine Lays, Damali Abrams, and Cherise Francis doing their own research in the archive. Huge supporters of trying to find ways that we, as artists, can continue to support Lloyd's legacy. If you can go to page 30. Just to go back quickly, work by artists who want to continue to remember Lloyd in this zine created by Damali Abrams, Forgotten Black Histories of Queens from 2024, a collage zine that works with some of the material Damali found in the archives. And in the next image, you see here Cherise Francis's project underneath Martin Puryear's sculpture. So trying to learn from Lloyd, where we activated some of the public artworks by doing art making activities under them to try to get people to think about the artwork through art making. Similar slides follow. If you can just go to the next one. Elizabeth Velasquez's project under Sam Gilliam's Solar Canopy, similar art activation project. And the next slide. And Regine Lay is doing paper casting off of Houston Conwell's sculpture because Conwell wanted people to touch the sculpture. So I think just thinking, what we've been trying to do is do research on Lloyd through thinking through too, like what did Lloyd want and how can we kind of continue to work within the practices that he tried to implement. That's been a great help, an obstacle undoer in research, because thinking through the way that artists in Southeast Queens want to honor Lloyd, I think is really critical and important.
I'm just going to ask one more question that I'd like the panelists to respond to briefly so we have enough time for questions from the audience. Lloyd called his sculptures electronic refractions, right? The first show at the Studio Museum in 1968 was called Electronic Refractions 2. He had done an Electronic Refractions 1 in 1965 at Amol Gallery. And we've been speaking about his practice in terms of its refractions, right? The ways in which Lloyd has reverberated across all spheres of the art world and a wider community. And I'd like to, if you could all speak about how you are seeing these reverberations or these refractions out in the world now. You're all kind of really researching different aspects of Lloyd's career. And so maybe talking about what you're seeing in terms of the impact that Lloyd has had, either recognized or unrecognized.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to start. I guess a few things. I guess, Lloyd didn't build just a museum. I feel like he really built like an infrastructure. And so there's so many ways that artists today have created or starting to create new spaces, new types of museums, new types of residencies, new types of support centers that are perhaps privately funded or have different funding structures apart from the government, given the current situation with the government's attention or lack of attention towards the arts right now. But I think it's also interesting too to think about ideology. Like I think I was so compelled by the Black Artists in America Symposium that I referenced in the beginning from 1969, where Lloyd and other Black artists are sort of arguing about what Black art is, I think there's also sort of an interest in this moment about redefining what that term means, and perhaps expanding it, thinking of both its limits and its possibilities of what Black art can be. And I find that within the classroom, I'm a grad student, and I find that, still a topic that we're discussing today, yeah.
I think that, one of the really interesting things for me is, seeing all the activations today, seeing the artists who are making odes to, Tom Lloyd's work. I remember years ago reading an interview with David Hammonds, and he was saying in the early 90s that he didn't think that he could work with light because as a Black artist, he wasn't free enough to do that. And I just thought that was such a profound statement from an artist who is so daring and kind of does everything. But it also made me think, well, how do we think about Lloyd? Like working even decades before Hammonds would try to just think of whether as a Black artist that he could work with light. And I guess I'm just really reflective, and of course Glenn Ligon has written about his interest in this history of artists working in light, but it's so great now that there's so many more examples and that Lloyd can actually become a source that people can use as a referent to think about what is possible for them to create and the broader history that they may see themselves as connected to as they make their artwork.
When you asked this question, it made me think about an essay by Denise Ferrer da Silva and Rizvana Bradley, their 4 theses on aesthetics. And in that essay, they contrast this metaphor of reflection that's equated with cognition, inherited from Enlightenment thinking, with refraction. And I was thinking about how reflection is off a surface, but refraction is bending light through a surface, right? Through a medium. And if I think of Lloyd, I think of, and Krista has also spoken to this too in her talks on Lloyd, that thinking of Lloyd, he's moving through the world and constantly trying to kind of resituate himself in response, but not being reactive, right? He's trying to find ways in which he can intervene and have things change direction, right? So he feels like this bending force. He feels like he's the one who's trying to be what will bend the light in the medium, right? And I think in every circumstance that you see him operating in, he's doing that. And I would say, I would like to share just this image of York students on slide 35. This is after the students had an opportunity to work with another great artist of the Southeast Queens Artist Alliance, Siobhan Nichols, who worked with them on curating a display in the York College Library. You see the tapestry by Romer Bearden right behind them. That was a purchase for the public art collection. And you see here the display that one of the display cases that they created. They are so thrilled and inspired to learn about Lloyd. And I can see the difference in how they think about what they themselves are doing when they start looking through the papers of Lloyd and when they start taking care of the work of other artists. They think about caring for each other, and that's the most important thing for them to learn in the process of becoming artists. And I think that Lloyd's seeing that in paper and learning that as a young artist, it's really impactful. You see it in them, and I think that's a beautiful thing. That's a beautiful, indelible image that Lloyd has left in also thinking of being able to donate those papers to the Queens Central Library. Though there are obstacles in the research, definitely, like it's hard because you want to be able to learn so much more about his practice, and what's not included in the papers is what is he thinking about his work, right? Which is the really critical work that you're doing when your monograph comes out. We're going to be really excited about it. But just to share that I think that, with refraction, I think especially you see it with the students, the kind of impact it has on them. Yeah.
Thank you all. We're going to now open it up to questions, and there's going to be a microphone. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand, and then my colleague will be coming to you with the microphone. I can't really see. Okay.
Hello. Thank you for this beautiful talk. My question's about Tom Lloyd's dual roles as both an artist and the founder of an institution. And I'm wondering how he saw his own practice as it related to the museum, and if he ever exhibited his work there, or if he saw it as a platform for his practice, or did he want to keep those things separate? Thank you.
I'm looking at his children, and from what I understand, and you all can correct me if I'm wrong, he really wanted, he set aside his own artistic practice in order to support the work of other artists, right? He stopped making the electronic light sculptures in 1968, and we don't quite know why he stopped making them. I have some suspicions, Krista has suspicions as to why he did, but there's no trace or there's no record, at least in terms of what we've seen, that definitively says that. I think he realized, right, and this is what Krista has explicated, right, he realized that he pivoted, right, in terms of this refraction, right, he pivoted his career to really thinking about how he can create access and community and opportunities for other people, not just artists, but also a larger community. And that work that he made, those electronic sculptures that utilize light, were his artistic attempt to do that, right? He was using materials that were accessible. He was thinking about community in terms of how they were made and who he was speaking to. But that understanding of access and community didn't actually resonate with a larger audience. And so that pivot, that ability to refract himself, right, that ability to change course to speak to a larger audience, I think is one of his greatest strengths. The fact that he was able to redirect his attention to create an institution. I will say we do know one of the friends that he made after the Storefront Museum was founded was a man named Francesco Cincata. And many of the works on paper that are in the third floor gallery are loans from him. And he talked about how Lloyd expressed frustration about the fact that he didn't have the time to devote to his own artistic practice anymore because he was giving so much of himself to the Storefront Museum. So I think there was some of that tension there, but I don't think he had any regrets. You know, he talked about that in the video that is upstairs in the third floor. He talked about how he had reached the point in his life where he realized everything that he had set out to do. I don't know if you have, yeah.
I would just add that I think Lloyd is also working before, like, what becomes known as social practice is a thing. And so I do think it might be useful to think of him as almost a precursor to kind of using one's own kind of artistic platform in these ways that is about forming community, is about engaging and creating these broader networks as a part of your own kind of practice. But I think I might see more of an arc than a break in terms of that kind of extension that happens in terms of his kind of just rethinking and studying kind of art institutions and what is possible within them and what his role would be in it.
I know.
Hello. As I'm reading the mission for the museum, I was thinking about how oftentimes in America there's this idea of like two separate histories. There's like American history and then there's Black history. And so I was wondering your thoughts on, as art historians, this. It seems like Lloyd was toying with that and saying, Black artists exist in this landscape as artists and not. And so I guess my question is, in your work, as you, especially as a professor, as art historians and writers, how do you reconcile the contributions of Black artists in the context of American art history? And I say this as an art student who studied art history. I didn't learn about Black artists in any of my surveys of American history, and it really makes me sad that I didn't find out about like Carol Walker and artists like Lloyd until after I graduated, and just thinking about how many Black students in legacy institutions who don't learn about the contributions of those artists, like, how do I want to say, at the same time or with the same level of, there's this distinction that happens where it's like, okay, these are the Black artists versus that. So just wondering your thoughts on that as you study Lloyd's work.
Maybe our two professors can respond.
I would say that I think that is changing, and I think that institutions like the Studio Museum are an important part of that. I do often wonder, one of the interesting things I had mentioned that Lloyd was really deeply wanting to start these study centers at a place like MoMA, and I always wonder, like, what would have happened? Oh, and actually, for a very brief moment, he was told that that would actually happen. But I've always wondered, like, what if that had actually happened, right? What if in the late 1960s, these institutions had set up and they'd started more actively archiving the work and providing this platform for the research, right? Often in the Art Worker Coalition protests and their transcripts of these very contentious meetings between the Art Workers Coalition and Lloyd and the administrators at different museums, often there would be this sense of like, well, we didn't know there were any Black artists that were working in the 1930s, right? So how do building archives, and his switch to be like, you know what, let's have these archives, let's have these research centers. So what would a research center, which had been funded and growing over the last 50 plus years, how would that reshape just the art histories that can be written? And so I do think that work is happening and that the show is a part of that shift. But there's still a whole lot of work to do to get there.
Yeah, that experience that you describe is exactly the experience I don't want students who take classes as part of the art history program at York to experience. And I can say that one of the ways that, for me at least, I go about doing that is also by using the art at the campus. It's integrated into my classes, almost all of them. Obviously, like even the classes, for example, that are out of the timeline, because those are classes that are dealing with like the Upper Paleolithic up until the 14th century or something. I'm still using the contemporary art on campus to ground the students, to help them to think about what artists are thinking about. And since, for example, Houston Conwell's work, you can think about the way that he was influenced by the Congo cosmogram. That is something that the students can learn through learning it through the way that an artist was thinking about that as an inspiration. So I think that thinking through, Lloyd's project is to really rethink what it means to tell histories of art. And that's a critical lesson that we learn from him, and make sure that we don't replicate what we experienced. I also went through the experience of, I didn't study art history actually as an undergraduate, because I was also always looking for Black artists in art history classes and not seeing them. And so for me, that was what I was interested in, and wasn't getting it. So I was going elsewhere. Let's say in the introductory classes, you wouldn't necessarily get that experience, though you should, right? So try not to replicate that.
I think we have time for maybe just one more question. Over here.
It's a very short question. I'd like you to expand on that David Hammond statement about light, please, in relationship to Lloyd also.
So there's an interview, I think it's 1993, in which I can't remember the exact lead up to it, but James Turrell is a part of this broader conversation that's going on. And somebody asks him about his interest in Turrell and so in response to thinking about Turrell, he says, I would like to be out there, like, using light like that. But as a Black artist, I'm not free enough yet. And I mean, we could spend the next hour trying to parse, the comments and the sometimes deliberate opacity but I think I'm just using it as a provocation because, of course, Hammonds goes on, to work with light, and very famously works with these small flashlights. But it's interesting in his mind as somebody who is so, who has rewritten the script on what Black art is, that he would think that there are prohibitions around his ability to use light and to tie that to freedom, right? And so I guess I'm just seeing it as a provocative way that if an artist at Hammond's stature, in the 1990s is hesitant about using light, how do we think about what Lloyd was doing in the 60s? And all of the repercussions of that. And so I guess I'm just using it to pose a set of questions that I think makes what Lloyd was doing even so much more kind of unique within this arc of artists who have been thinking about light within their artistic practice.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. We're so thrilled that we're able to inaugurate our space. The galleries are open for another 2 hours. I think. Oh, Thelma Golden.
We're not done yet. We're not done. First of all, Krista, Emily, Habiba, thank you for being here with us tonight. I also want to thank and acknowledge again the Lloyd family, right? Your ability to let us be a part of this legacy means so much. And I also want to thank the lenders. These works that we have had the privilege to have here, some are in the room, some are elsewhere, our amazing public programs team and their colleagues in IT and tech and VE and everyone who made this whole day happen, as well as this particular event. It's the amazing Studio Museum team. But I want you all to join me and really thank Connie Choi, who, that's right, Connie, who has stewarded this exhibition, which was so much more than an exhibition, right? It was this whole project and process. And as we thought about what it meant 7 years ago when we closed this building, 11 years ago when we started imagining building a building, and 15 years ago, right, when we began the idea to make a new studio museum, the idea that we could open with this exhibition as our museum opened in 1968 was the greatest gift for me to be able to have a way that we could think about not only our past, but our future. So Connie, thank you and congratulations for this and for the collective that has come together to make this happen. And I want to thank all of you for being here with us. So thank you. Now, I think Connie was going to say the galleries are open, so please feel free. And this exhibition is open tomorrow, so please tell all of your friends to please come Studio Sunday tomorrow for the last day of this exhibition. So thank you. Thank you all.